All right, I think this is going to be really fun, especially since I have no direct connection to the space industry outside of being just a really big fan. And I was kind of joking, I was writing ahead of time, is that in the past week or two, I've watched with my family and my 11-year-old, we watched Stargate, Contact, Arrival, and the SpaceX Catch. And then in a couple of days, we're going to go see Starship 6 launch. So it's, I think, an exciting time both in what we think is possible and then what actually is possible. And so I'm actually really excited to talk with you guys about what's real, what's happening, and what kind of is coming next in the future. So if I want to start off with, if you each kind of introduce yourself, the types of the missions that you were on and what the objectives were, and what was the one most unexpected thing when you got to space?
Well, I guess I go first. My name's Chris Sembroski. I was on the Inspiration 4 mission. We've been talking a lot about that mission today. I was a mission specialist for that mission, and now currently I am at Blue Origin as an avionics technician, working on New Glenn. And what the most unexpected thing in space? I think I said this earlier today, and it was how mesmerizing it was to see lightning from the tops of clouds on the night side of the Earth. An incredible fireworks show.
Very cool.
So I'm Annalisa Paul. I am not an astronaut, but have not been to space, but I'm a long-term space researcher. And my colleague Rob Ferl and I have been doing space research for the last 20-odd years. And our experiments have flown to the space station, on suborbital space, and on all manner of other kind of exploration environments. But the most extraordinary thing happened quite recently. Instead of having to train NASA astronauts to run our experiments, we had the extraordinary opportunity to, and I will pass it to Rob.
Train me. And that was a big task. So yeah, I'm Rob Ferl. Together with Annalisa, we are at the University of Florida, and we are long-term space biologists. Well, we're starting to also now talk about the distinction between studying space biology and being a space biologist. And I hope that's something that we can talk thematically about at some point. There's a lot of us that have spent a lot of time studying things that happen in space, doing things that affect the way we live and work in space. It's a very special opportunity to be granted the ability to go into space to do a space experiment. We'll talk more about that in a little bit, I hope. But we've seen various parts of this today where being a scientist doing the experiment, and I don't mean this in any sort of negative way, as opposed to handing off the experiment to be done, really adds a whole nother dimension of our understanding, our ability to interpret as well what those data say.
So we were talking off to the side before you come on stage, and I told you I was going to bring it up, but space peppers. So what is the difference between, I think you were saying, sending something up into space versus growing it in space, and how are we differentiating between that? So what are space peppers?
Okay, so on the Inspiration 4 mission, it was not that big of a thing. It was, let's send some space seeds up with us, let's expose them to slightly higher altitudes than the space station, bring them back, and then have a growing competition to see who can grow the best space peppers. I think Jared won by hands down. It took me 3 years to get one pepper to grow. But beyond that, nothing.
None of them talked or anything,
No
right?
one said, hey, Seymour, and yeah, no, it was, yeah. No, that was our experience with peppers, but I think you guys.
So space peppers can be, or the seeds can be a touchstone then for something else that actually is very important. You send seeds to space, they grow in space. And so you guys, the seeds went up and the seeds came back down. But the way we do it, when we send experiments to space, we do, in our orbital experiments, we send the seeds up as seeds. They grow on the space station, they live their lives there, we extract their DNA and RNA and do all the transcriptome stuff that Chris was and we're talking about earlier. But what we haven't done, we as scientists anywhere haven't done, is ask, how do plants perceive the journey? not just as dormant seeds going up to space. And so for the suborbital experiment that Rob worked on and did on Blue Shepherd or Blue Origin, he asked, could he do the fixation of these plants as they were experiencing this in real time? And that was an insight into the molecular processes of how plants work and how plants adjust that's never been done before. And so that was pretty extraordinary.
So what did we find?
Well,
Before we talk about what we found, because we're just learning now, a couple of things that are worth, I think, a really deep perspective by everybody in the room here. This has been a wonderful day talking about a lot of science going on in space, mostly about the science that happens inside our bodies or inside our tools that we use to keep humans alive. Please remember that there is an entire ecosystem of terrestrial things, beings, organisms that are important to us when we go to space. We take our microorganisms with us, and there's no way around that. We will take our plants with us because we need their oxygen, food, and water recycling and things like that. But moreover, and we say this all the time, plants share 50% of our genetic identity with humans, right? We have the same core metabolisms. We have a lot of the same genes. We can learn a lot from plants when we go to space. So when you ask about peppers in space, you're actually asking a much deeper question about the overall concept of what happens to terrestrial biology when it goes to a place for which it has no evolutionary preparedness to go. So we learn about the limits of our adaptive processes, the amount of adaptive process that is encoded in our genes and allows us to get beyond where we were sort of set up to go. As Annalisa mentioned about the particulars of our experiment with the new shepherd, you may not realize it, but almost every experiment, space biology experiment in the last decades, forever, has begun once everybody's in orbit. Very few experiments have been done on the way. In the space shuttle era, they spent their first half an hour reconfiguring the vehicle to put the chairs away and get their suits off, right? So there's no experiments that have been done to actually understand what happens during those first few seconds of becoming a terrestrial organism to becoming an extraterrestrial organism. And that's what we're trying to understand right now is that difference. Because anybody that works in biology knows that if this is state B and this is state A, there's no straight line between A and B. We go up, we go down, we come to a new equilibrium. We know about the equilibrium of being in space. We know a lot about it. We know very little about what the process is of adapting there.
Question, given we talk about, obviously, we've not had anything that's been evolutionarily in space, and this might be my own lack of knowledge, have we been doing fruit fly experiments in space given the ability to do, quick evolutionary turns of them?
oh yeah, sure. I mean, we haven't, but that research indeed has been done. Things with like fruit flies and roundworms and different kinds of organisms that cycle very fast. And also Arabidopsis, the kind of plants that we work with, have also been gone seed to seed and looked at 2 generations of those things.
When I see going back, and obviously you see things, in science fiction and the hypothesis of major evolutionary change if we become, a multiplanetary species. When we look at the actual science of whether it be the fruit flies, roundworms, or the plants, what are we seeing in, obviously it's only a couple of generations, are we seeing significant change? Are we seeing small change? What are we seeing?
Well, we do see changes. A recent epigenetic experiment that Rob and I did, for instance, is we do see that changes are happening to the plant genomes. Now, it's not the kind of big mutation things that sometimes you hear about, like in science fiction and stuff, but there also are small changes that plants and other organisms, even humans, undergo when they are in a stressful or a novel environment that essentially kind of puts a pin in a spot of where their genome is. It says, I want to access that gene again quickly. And this is what we call epigenetics. And it's the kind of sort of tags or signals that an organism uses to say, yeah, I want to get back to that fast so I can adapt more quickly.
So from a long-term perspective, is it that we would be under a constant state of stress if we were going to be, we're on Mars, we're on this kind of consistently in space? Or is it that we need to have some sort of way to tone that back?
When you think about stress, it's much like Rob just said, it's state A and state B. And so you may not think of a nice cool day as stress because you know how to put on a sweater. So a plant has to adapt to that environment by weaving its own sweater from the inside to adapt to that. It's not that it's stress anymore because they've made that change. So that environment is no longer stressful, but they've taken active processes to ameliorate that stress.
Chris, I want to come in, being at Blue Origin, and I think about we're talking about the biology of, we're talking about stress and being a multiplanetary series, but to have space travel and habitation be a more normal thing, what are kind of the known unknowns? Is it just or are there technical breakthroughs that we still need? Is it just scale? Is it we just, we need more rockets to work? Is it data? Like what's keeping us back from getting there?
I mean, I think you're seeing that evolution happen. You're seeing the rate of flight increase, and that's a huge part of it. If you're going to build a multi-million-dollar vehicle, a billion-dollar vehicle, whatever the cost is, you need to be using it more than once. And so you're seeing reusability happen with New Shepard. It's going to be happening with New Glenn. It happens with Falcon 9. Starship is supposed to be practically all reusable. That's what's enabling that barrier to entry to get into space to drop dramatically. So and what that does, it enables all these other ideas, these other projects and ideas that are coming to the table to be able to afford the opportunity to go to space, which we haven't seen before. When it was $25,000 a pound, $10,000 a pound on the space shuttle, it was absolutely prohibitive to send a college students or even high school students experiment up into space. We're seeing rideshare programs on New Shepard and on other missions that are they're opening up doors. You're seeing CubeSats having the opportunity to fly in space and do deeper research with demographics and students that have prohibitively been kept back because the costs have just been too expensive. And so those costs coming down is what's really going to accelerate the speed of innovation in science that we're going to continue to see. And it's going to allow more people to experience being in space, and not just from the biological standpoint, but what does space do to the mind, to the body, to the spiritual side of someone? What message do they bring back, and can you share that with a wider community? And when you have a wider community of people that have a shared experience, that message just starts to reverberate, and people start to understand what that means and what the Earth is really all about.
So what else does space open up as an innovation platform itself? Like you talk about like the spiritual aspect and those kind of messages, but what are the things that we can do in space that we couldn't do here? What almost as an innovation platform in and of itself, what are the things that open up if your point that it's cheap to go to space, it's now available?
Yeah. Well, we've seen some presentations on it today, but with BioAstra talking about they're trying to get their orbits, there's going to be their product called Orbit up into space. And then you're seeing massive constellations of communication satellites that now can have the opportunity to go to space because they can afford the launch cost. And it's opening up communication around the world. You're no longer going to have dead zones around the world. And you can talk from your cell to a satellite without the risk of getting lost or losing a signal, and it's going to save lives. In terms of research, I'm going to have to pass the mic on that one and say, what other things are you guys curious about that you haven't had a chance to do yet? I think there's a lot left to be discovered, but I don't know from an engineer's point of view who works in avionics. No, I don't always understand what are you guys curious about finding out and hope you could maybe see one day.
As evidenced by everything I think that we've talked about today, there are still a lot of unknowns having to do with space flight. We haven't talked at all about the physical sciences, the interaction of materials that are small and where gravity can take place, even on small bits, because the microgravity environment allows the study of those kind of interactions. Fluid mechanics is something that we need to know an awful lot more about, especially if we're going to live and work in the space flight environment. So there are as many questions out there as I think scientists that are willing to start probing in this area. One of the things
Can
that
you break down, so I did not go that far in physics and fluid mechanics. Why is the microgravity on that? Why does that become important? Like, what am I missing in terms of what can go wrong, or what does that in the long term happen?
Well, it makes a cup of coffee a lot harder to drink in space,
Yeah.
for one, but yeah.
Okay, I'm not going to space, and if I can't have my coffee, I'm not going to space.
And even simple things like fluid mechanics was mentioned earlier today about the pipettes and the test tubes. One of the reasons I got to fly is because we used a thing called a Kennedy Space Center fixation tube, a KFT, often used on orbit to allow the safe mixing of a fluid, a preservative fluid, and a biological sample, which you can't do because it's 100 mils of stuff. You can't pour it, you can't do anything with it, but you need that to do your experiment. These things were built so that people on orbit could do these experiments safely. Part of our job in this particular flight with Blue Origin was to show that those things are deployable inside the Blue Origin capsule. So in other words, the processes, procedures could be put in place to use that technology. And then the other side is that we had biology questions that needed to be answered by managing the fluids properly in order to do the experiment.
So it seems to be a lot harder to do those experiments, but at the same time, I keep hearing those companies like Varda and others that talk about pharmaceutical manufacturing in space, and there seems to be a lot of advantages from doing that. So what are the advantages then of doing that type of manufacturing in space? Like taking advantage of the microgravity?
That really sounds like an engineering question. Chris?
Well, kind of. I mean, it's from what I understand of it, and this is just my low-level expertise on it, that growing proteins in space is a lot like growing crystals. And if you're trying to develop this complex protein structure that you're hoping to investigate and understand its makeup, and it easily collapses when it's here on Earth, microgravity gives you that opportunity to allow you to grow these crystals in a more, I guess, natural, yet not natural since you're microgravity kind of way. And so allows you to understand the physics of how the inner workings of a crystal and molecular structure function. And so I think that's what the pharmaceuticals industries might be trying to achieve, because if you can understand and manufacture drugs that have these complex microstructures, and I can look at the audience and you can shake your head no or shake your head yes, see if I'm anywhere close. I might be off in left field, but having that opportunity and to do that, understand that in space, and as you see commercial space stations come online that provide more commercial access and commercial space to manufacture things, then those opportunities start to scale up, and again, that cost comes down. And I don't know if I said this earlier, but the things that we were talking about, like as we start to solve some of these problems in space, we're solving problems for here on Earth. Or as Dr. Proctor would say, I don't know if she's going to be able to join us by Zoom later or not, but she constantly says, and it always sticks with me, that solving for space is solving for Earth. And that's a big part of what we're trying to accomplish.
So to really take advantage of the kind of commercial era and go that next step, what is it that we really need? Is it another space station? Is it a space elevator? Like we're allowed to go sci-fi here. We're allowed to go to the next step. Like to really take us to, being a commercially space is part of our lives. What are the things that we need?
Well, I just had this quick question back to you. So when your kids were watching all these videos, which one did they say was real? Could they determine which one was sci-fi and which was not? I wonder, did they have that thought? Did they know that something was true in there?
It's funny to watch when so how quickly they realize some of this stuff now, and kind of like when my so it was all with my 11-year-old. So like Stargate, he immediately was like, oh, it's a portal. Like with even before they get to that point, and then kind of watching the different aspects. But one was of course like why are they when watching, and obviously these are old movies, so they're not spoiling anything, but like context, like why are they making it so complicated when the aliens come? Like just show up, right? Like and give us more answers. But it's funny to watch those things, and then when you see what is possible now, and I've told a few people this story, and just the belief on what is happening. So I was at the Houston Space and Rocket Museum a few weeks ago. Actually, it was the day before the SpaceX rocket catch, and we were touring the Saturn V, which is I'd never been face to face with before, and is gigantic. And I happened to be telling my oldest that I was like, the Starship is even bigger, and the docent tour guide, who happened to be like 5 feet from me, says, oh, well, that's not real yet. And I was like, excuse me? It's the 5th launch is tomorrow. And so it's funny that you ask of like, what do they say as we're watching this, when there are people who don't even realize what's going on right now. And then we watch the catch the next morning.
Yeah, so I mean, I've heard people talk about the history of space flight. We had Space 1.0, which was the capsule days leading up to our landing on the moon. Space 2.0 came with the space shuttle. Space 3.0 is when we had a permanent place in space to go to with the International Space Station. And we're in the middle of Space 4.0 right now. And I'm excited for what 5.0 happens as we get these large vehicles online that provide these opportunities. In terms of what's going to enable that sci-fi future to happen, first and foremost, I think what you were doing with your kids was absolutely phenomenal, because inspiring that creativity, getting them to think a little bit outside the box of what they think is normal. We see cell phones that we put in our pockets every day that were inspired by flip phones from Star Trek back in the 60s, right? So there are other things that just keep coming to light that we once just imagined as sci-fi, and now we're seeing it be science fact. And what it's going to take to really go to the next level, or we're seeing it every day. There's not just one level we're trying to achieve. It's the grind up the hill.
Right. And part of that is all these vehicles, they need destinations. And so the big things about, as we as species taking our biology and ourselves off our planet, what are we going to do with that capability? Or are we going to have long-term orbital facilities where we can continue to do the kind of suborbital to orbital kind of work? Are we going to have planetary outposts on the moon and Mars to be able to take our species off planet? And for all those things, all those capabilities, what do we need next? We need to be able to understand how our biology is going to react in these new environments. We're going to have to understand the engineering that will go into creating safe and productive habitats, and how our biology will respond. And of course, we'll need plants, because they are the things that will allow us to explore past the limits of a picnic basket. And that's the kind of research that all has to go forward now under some of the commercial auspices that we find ourselves with in Space 5.0.
I think there's an additional, more proximal need, and because we're right on the cusp. The things you were talking about this morning about having an entire science crew based on your offerings, the idea that science is going to occur in Blue Origin's New Shepard or in the next Virgin Galactic vehicles. Remember, what we're doing there is we're asking vehicles that were built for either science, automated payloads, or people, but we still don't know a lot about how to do the science and the people at the same time in those vehicles. And simple things that for us as scientists are still yet to be sort of returned to standard practice. One of them, for example, is when we did our experiment, we did sampling on the flight. At the same time, we needed sampling on the ground to be correlated. Why? Because biology changes through the day. So you can't just say, oh, I started out like this, and then on the flight I went from here to here to here. You also need to know what happens on an identical, maybe not a twin, but a genetically identical thing on the ground. What does that take? That takes communication. Is communications good? Yeah, it's okay. But there's a lot not done. And besides communication, it also takes the infrastructure. You'd be surprised. The setup for a human flight, in terms of people, in terms of procedures, is done by this group over here. The setup for a science flight, without astronauts, without paying people, is done over here. Now the two have to talk together if we are going to continue to develop these sort of early entry vehicles as true science vehicles, in order to do the ground controls at the same time, in order to do the communications that allow problem solving in very real time if something happens during the flight, especially with a suborbital flight, which is a fairly short flight window.
So I want to open it up for a couple of questions, if anyone has any.
This is less a question from the panel and more from a side discussion that we had earlier on your research on plants in microgravity. But I was fascinated by the epigenetic effect of what you were saying happens when plants go into microgravity from not developing in microgravity. Would you be able to give like a one-sentence explainer of the biggest impact you saw? I know that's like maybe not easy, but
Sure. Now, so when anything experiences some type of novel environment, they have a response. We think of this response, we say things like, oh, the patterns of gene expression, which goes over for a lot of folks. But what that is really is pulling out metabolic tools out of the toolbox. And so you understand what you need by what you pull out of that metabolic toolbox. What epigenetics can also do is that it puts a little pager, a tag on that particular tool. And so the next time you have to go into the toolbox, you can find it in the dark. And so it allows an organism to be predisposed to then respond to a similar type of stress or similar type of environment. And that's what we found. We found that a lot of the genes, a lot of the tools that were being used, they're being expressed in spaceflight, were associated also with the same parts of the DNA that also had these epigenetic tags on them. And that's one of the things that led us to think that the responses that are happening are important to the plants and important to the adaptive strategy of those plants.
I'd like to make one more brief comment about plants. Remember we talked about seeds go to orbit or someplace else and they grow from that seed into a plant. I want you to just remember that adult plant started as a small embryo in that seed. The most that we know about the full life cycle of terrestrial organisms in space doesn't come from humans, doesn't come from mice, it comes from plants who started out as a few hundred cells as an embryo and turned into, guess what? A very real terrestrial looking plant, even though they grew in space. A lot of big developmental decisions, some of them keyed by epigenetic markers, happen in space just the same way they happen in the ground. To me, that's the most astounding non-result you can imagine. How, I mean, good grief. Every plant was designed to live here on the earth under one gravity. So many of the things that we think are determined by gravity in growth and development of all organisms, including plants, we figure gravity is a part. We were wrong on a lot of that. So that by itself, that simple non-observation that plants are plants in space, same way as they're here on the ground, I find astounding.
Well, and to take that one step more, and they reproduce fine on orbit. This progeny that comes from the ones they reproduced on orbit, they grow just fine in their next generation. And so, yeah, life finds a way.
Thank you so much. There's two questions. The first is really, I'm really concerned about crew time for lunar activities. So you're going to have biomonitoring tools that are extremely automated. I'm just curious, it's an opportunity, especially for the plant biology. What's the status of, I know Melanie Carell, and there's a couple people that are working on plant crop automation, because crew are going to be concerned with the early missions with surviving, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and it'll be a little different. And then the second is on microbial engineering. If there's any microbial engineering going on that could be beneficial either to plant health or human health, even like thinking of bacteriophages, that it doesn't seem to come into our literature and our science quite a bit, but I know the terrestrial world has thought about this for some time, how phages are a road forward as well for help. So I'm just curious if there's any on either question.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, so in very general terms, okay, the answer is yes. People are working on all those kinds of things, not us per se, but there are lots of people who are working on synthetic biology solutions, on engineering of biological organisms in conglomeration with engineering of habitats and things, like some of the stuff that you're talking about that Melanie Carell is doing with the automations and stuff. And so all of those things I think are important in the general field of being able to do things with crew time and resources and stuff. But I don't think I have a specific answer for you of who's doing what, but I do know that those things are happening.
One sort of orthogonal reply to that is that people like plants. We've worked in the Arctic and in Antarctica where finding crew time to work with plants is not hard because they'd rather do that. You go from a perfectly sterile environment into the growth chamber and you're with plants, you smell it. It's like coming home to earth. One of my favorite quotes is from Peggy Whitson, who very clearly says, I quote, "And today I got to work with the plants." Not I had to work with the plants, though they made me work with the plants. No, I got to work with the plants today.
All right, we'll have you be the last question.
Sure. Can I just go back, speaking from a position of complete ignorance, on the non-observation discussion that was going on, what did you expect? How did you expect plants to grow in zero gravity? And what are the implications that they continue to grow in the structured way that they do?
Oh, you had to ask.
I did have to ask.
This is wonderful. So if you close your eyes and you think about what would a plant look like growing in microgravity, you might envision that the roots are growing squirrely all over the place. And that's actually not what happens. And so if you give plants another cue as to which way to grow, they will, when they don't have gravity, they'll use light. And so what they do is the roots will grow away from the light. However, it's not straight away. And because they don't have gravity that's pulling them in a specific direction, what they'll use is some of the inherent mechanisms that gets a root to grow away from where it's planted. Because if it doesn't, then the plant will die, because it has to go off and search things. And so what we found, and we in fact did these experiments, there's a lot of mechanisms that plants use to be able to navigate away from where they're planted that is guided by certain sets of genes. And later, if you want, we can go into all of what those nuances, but Rob's going to start rolling his eyes if I go into too much more detail.
But is that a function, for example, of the fact that when you're growing plants in space, you're still collecting the soil in a manner that is contiguous with the experience here on Earth? Or?
Right. And so a lot of the fundamental experiments that are done on space are not done in what you would think of soil, because way too messy would get everywhere, right? So we did a lot of our fundamental experiments growing things on square Petri plates that have a nutrient auger in them, and so you can see the patterns of how they're grown. For these multiple generation experiments that we'd also talked about, they grow into a specialized, well, it's arsenite, this capillary mat stuff that can grow. So it is different than growing on Earth, you're absolutely correct, but the same fundamental mechanisms, whether you're growing in soil or you're growing on a surface of an auger plate, much like Rob said, all these are done in lockstep with the ground control, where we have the one-to-one correlation in the same substrates. Does that answer that?
Yes. I guess my final follow-up is I was on a panel recently with a company that is and it's not the only organization that is aiming to have the first human embryo grown in space. What are the implications of the work you've done with plants for how biological specimens might be able to grow, if at all? The ethical questions aside, I think if it's even possible to put the ethical questions aside, what are the implications for the potential for animals to grow and be born in space?
So I can't directly answer that question. I'll let you guys give that a better shot. But from just an experience point of view, that I can only imagine how different my flight would have been if Earth wasn't always up for us. And which is strange to say. I know we're up. Anytime I give someone a gift as a picture, I feel like they put it on the wall upside down. But that's because when we were looking in our cupola bubble out at the Earth, nose cone facing the Earth, to us, as we go into the cupola bubble, Earth was up. And so having that kind of being our fixed point that didn't rotate or change dynamically, Earth wasn't behind us or in front of us or to the side. It was relatively in the same place. It was kind of our constant. I don't know what that means for development of embryos, but I know it was something that I think we took for granted on our mission, added a little bit less complication.
I think we could probably do a whole panel on the ethical and biological aspects of embryo development in space. And I want to make sure we're still on time so I don't get the big hook. I always like to end with the same question. And so I'm going to ask to try to do this in each of you in like one sentence, because again, we could do this for another hour. So what's next for science in the commercial space age?
More scientists flying to do their experiments in space.
More research in how we effectively take our biology off the planet to have long-term existence elsewhere.
Recognizing that it's not going to end with us, that we have to keep inspiring that next generation to pick up all those things that we just mentioned.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. This has been great. So what's next, Austin? We're glad you've joined us on this journey. Please subscribe at your favorite podcast catcher, leave us a review, and let your colleagues know about us. This will help us grow the podcast and continue bringing you unique interviews and insights. Thanks again for listening, and see you soon.